Welcome to this webinar, hosted by the 21st Century China Center at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. I'm Barry Naughton. I'm the So Kwan Luk Chair of Chinese and International Affairs, and I'm delighted to welcome Professor Yasheng Huang from the MIT Sloan School. Thank you, everybody, for joining our discussion today. This webinar is recorded and will be available on video and podcast, and it can be accessed on our website, china.ucsd.edu. Professor Yasheng Huang is the EPIC Foundation Professor of International Management and Faculty Director of Action Learning at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Professor Huang's currently involved in research projects in 4 broad areas: a book on the nature of the Chinese state, collaboration with researchers at Tsinghua on technological innovation, which I think is going to contribute to today's talk. Third, a co-PI on food safety in China. And fourth, research on venture finance production of scientific knowledge and the future in China. Professor Huang has published numerous books, and I would like to say, just as a personal note, I'm looking forward to this talk very much. It's new, completely new work for me. But having read 5 of Yasheng's books already, which is already saying something. If you're willing to read 5 books by one person, you know that person is pretty interesting. But also I would say every one of those books has displayed Yasheng's most distinctive feature, which is that he approaches issues in a creative, new way that always sheds new light on the topic he's dealing with. So I'm looking forward to seeing Yasheng do that today as well. Yasheng, thanks for coming. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Barry. Also setting up a very high expectations, and I hope I don't fail flat on my face. And thank you for inviting me to the webinar, and it is really just tremendous to have UCSD to be such a prominent leading voice on China, on U.S.-China relations. I have the pleasure to work with Barry, with Susan, and with others in the past year on a task force study, and I learned a lot, and so my heartfelt appreciation for involving me in this project. Today, I'm going to talk about a project that I'm working on, and let me share the screen. And so it has kind of a cheeky title, has the East Risen Again, Lessons and Experiences from History. And from the title, maybe you can tell that this is, I'm trying to write this maybe for a more general audience rather than for a straight academic audience. But it is based on a number of research projects that we have been doing. And the most important words on this slide are these, very preliminary, and those are the most accurate words there. So I really look forward to discussions with Barry and to discussions with the audience. So as I said before, I'm writing this, and it is actually very hard writing for trying to write for a general audience. It is based on academic work. I'm collaborating with Claire Yang, a professor at University of Washington, on a number of projects on civil service examination. And I'm going to draw a lot from the work that we're doing. And we have a paper forthcoming from Journal of Politics. We use the data from the Qing dynasty to look at how the civil service examination system promoted the longevity of the Chinese imperial system. And then we're working on another paper on the great political divergence. And the basic idea of that paper is that around 11th century, there was a divergence between the West and the East in terms of the shape of political institutions, but they converge on political stability. So the emperors and the rulers began to rule for a longer period of time than before. So we're trying to explain why this happened. And then I'm collaborating with a number of Chinese academics on mostly historical developments of technology, and then bring some implications to the current period. We already finished the book in Chinese, and we decided to rewrite the whole thing in English. So that's some of the materials I'm using today come from that project. And then I'm working with my PhD student on exam cognition and big data, and that turns out to be also relevant. And also, as Barry said, that we're building data sets. One is the Chinese invention data set going back to history with Tsinghua University. And I'm going to show you some of the results of that data analysis. And the other is that we have a number of data building efforts on politics, historical politics. So let me introduce the basic idea of the book. And I call it the yeast formulation, the yeast package. And it is an effort to understand both historical and contemporary China through the lens of four factors, four forces. Examination. It's education, but it's a particular kind of education. It's exam-based education. So it's not any kind of education. It's a particular kind of education, examination. And autocracy, and specifically during history, the trajectory of autocracy. So we don't take autocracy as a given condition. There's actually evolution and change historically of a Chinese autocracy. Stability, and in particular, the ability of the system to manage intra-elite conflicts. It turns out that the thing that usually destabilizes the authoritarian system is the intra-elite conflicts, rather than peasant rebellions and or those guys storming into the Congress. That's actually rare. What usually topples the authoritarian system is the elite rebellion. So we argue that Chinese system has a very effective way of dealing with elite rebellions. And technology, the rise and fall of inventions in historical China. And you may argue that maybe today China, there's a rise again. Remember that China used to be a technological powerhouse ahead of the West. There's always debate among historians and economists why China lost that lead and China didn't initiate its own industrial revolution. So part of my book also focuses on that. And more importantly than just sort of presenting these four factors is trying to understand the interplay among these four factors. What's the relationship between E and A and S and T? So today, my presentation is going to be, is mainly about that. It's trying to illustrate the interplays among these four factors. So, so what I will do in just 30 minutes is introduce the argument at a very, very high level, and then provide some statistical aggregates, historical narratives on politics and technology. And these are, because this is a short talk of fairly high level, all of it is at a very high level. I'm going to focus on history, but I'm going to end by drawing implications for today's China. But I'm not going to go into great details about today's China. So let me just sort of say what the argument is. The argument is that the most important element in this East package is the first letter, is the E. Basically, examination system, the civil service examination system, CSE, or a Keju, established in 605 by the Sui dynasty. That's the hook to understand the three other elements in this East formulation. So what is the impact of CSE? One is that it decimated the marketplace of ideas and paved the way for the rise of a powerful ruling ideology, right? So it has this tremendous effect. Later on, I'm going to provide some nuance, which is that it is not true that as soon as the system was established in 605, it began to do these things. It took actually another 700 years for the CSE to be improved upon, to be perfected, to be reconfigured. So a lot of the effects don't really come immediately after the 7th century. A lot of effects come after the 9th century, 10th century, 11th century, because it took time. And then the other function of the CSE is this, what I call screening function. Basically examination system to test the talents of the candidates. And that basically enables the state to monopolize talents. Right? So a lot of the talents flow into the state, making it powerful and intellectually capable. It is also used to vet the aptitude, including the political aptitude of the candidates. So this is what's so smart about the system. It has a way to vet your technical capabilities. It also has a way to vet your political orientations. And later on, I'm going to talk about how the system does that. It has this enabling function. It creates a powerful incentive system for the political and economic elites. And this is the point I was driving at, that the Chinese system had an effective way of dealing with intra-elite conflicts because it creates an incentive system. It also promoted social mobility. So arguably, it also reduced peasant rebellions, mass uprisings. Although I have to say, although that function has been highlighted by a lot of historians, and also some papers more recently by modern social scientists, we actually don't see very strong evidence that CSE introduced peace with the masses. So later on, I'm going to show you some of the data. It also affected cognition, and this is borrowing from psychological literature. For sure, it is good for raising literacy, because when you prepare for these exams, you start at the age of 4, at the age of 5. So you start very early. And this is a lifelong endeavor. So you don't stop at the age of 18. You can actually continue. For example, in the data set on the Ming Dynasty CSE exam candidates, the oldest person who succeeded at the exam is 75. The youngest person is 11. So it's a huge range. So this is not like SAT, you just take it at the age of 17 and you are done with it. This is something you do for the entire life. So it probably improved literacy. And what's also interesting is that it actually improved women's literacy as well, because women, even though the exam was only available to men, women, the mothers and the grandmothers, were the ones that started educate their grandchildren, grandsons, and sons. So it was the women that did the education. So women had to be educated as well. Uh, it, it incubated a particular kind of mindset. It's very introspective, inward-looking mindset, and it is very much sort of a formulaic thinking rather than analytical thinking, right? So the exam format is very, very rigid. The famous eight-leg essay format, 八股文, right? So all these is not very good for analytical thinking. It is formulaic thinking, and that has implications for science because formulaic thinking is not very compatible with scientific thinking. So these four big functions have done a number of things. They led to the rise of single ruling ideology and Confucianism. And Confucianism didn't have to compete with religion or other secular ideas. Later on, I'm going to show you a graph that shows that even Buddhism, Taoism were marginalized by Confucianism. So because exam was only focused on Confucianism, at the expense, at the exclusion of everything else, it became a single dominant ideology. It definitely improved the capabilities of the state, right? So you got a lot of smart people, at least smart at taking exam, populating the bureaucracy. And you can also, and the other thing that I should have put it there is that it enables the state to scale because you figure out this standardization of human talents. You can also standardize the testing of political human capital. So you can make the state very, very big. When you have a big state, you can execute big projects. Incentive compatibility, I mentioned that before. Reduction of intra-elite conflicts. So the cumulative outcome of that is you get autocracy with long-term stability, right? So that explains the two letters in the East formulation, autocracy and stability. So what I'm going to show later on is you only get this autocracy with long-term stability after China introduced CSE, not before, right? So it was not always the case that China had autocracy with long-term stability. It was only after they introduced the CSE, you began to have that. What about technological development? There are definitely positive effects you can think of, higher literacy, right? And you have a state that is able to organize big projects. And when you can organize the big projects, you can also scale technology, right? Think about the canal, the Grand Canal. Think about the ships that the Song Dynasty and Ming Dynasty built, right? So these are massive projects. When you have massive projects, you can also scale the technology. But a lot of it is negative. It decimated the marketplace for ideas, right? At least the conventional view on innovation is that it requires the different ideas competing with each other. It requires some democracy. It requires academic freedom. The civil service exam eliminated any of that freedom. Even though it was good for scaling the technology, But because the state had a monopoly to scale technology, once the state changes its mind, you don't scale the technology at all, right? So let me make it very concrete. Zheng He's voyages, 7 voyages during the Ming Dynasty. These are massive ships, much bigger than the Columbus ships to North America. They had 7 of them. But once the emperor decided not to do these voyages anymore, nothing happened. Absolutely zero thing happened after that, right? So you can go from a lot to zero. That's the problem with the state, the monopoly to scale technology. So therefore, it reduces the sustainability of technology applications. I mean, in the ideal situation, what you want is not so much the scale, but scalability, right? So you can have something initially small, but then gradually grow big. That's what you want. What Chinese had during the ancient times was something very big. And when the emperor changed his mind, it became nothing. And that's not really very good for technology development. And as I said before, this formulaic rather than analytical thinking is not very good for scientific development. But the trick is how to demonstrate these ideas. Much of the book is developing these ideas, working out these ideas, and expanding on these ideas. So the empirical strategy here is identifying matches in timing. I mean, on a historical scale, so I cannot be very precise. This is historical data. They are very crude and high level. So essentially what you want to do is to look at the patterns. What happened before the CSE was introduced and what happened after the CSE was introduced in terms of politics, in terms of inventions. So that's the empirical strategy. You can, it's probably not, we're not able to run very fancy statistical tests. It's just looking at the matches in timing. So let me say a little bit about the CSE. CSE has 3 levels. You move from provincial exams to metropolitan exams and then to palace exams. And before that, you actually have to take qualifying exams. And before that, you went to public school and then private lessons. China began to have a public educational system in the Song Dynasty, right? So we're talking about the 10th century, 11th century. That was really, really advanced for the purpose of preparing for the CSE. The system was widely admired by Western Enlightenment thinkers, for example, by Francois Quesnay, a French physiocratic thinker. And he has a very interesting take on the CSE. He said that CSE is meritocratic, and therefore you have meritocracy that is able to constrain the king. So I don't know if people know this, Quesnay coined the term laissez-faire. According to legend, he coined the laissez-faire term to refer to China because he thinks that the Chinese bureaucrats can operate free of constraints by the emperor because of the civil service examination system. So this is a little bit of a historical anecdote. I think he's massively wrong, but that's a very interesting way to frame the CSE. Established in 605 by the Sui dynasty, and then, as I said before, it took 700 years. Basically, by the end of the Song dynasty, you got a working version of operating system. So it took 700 years to get there. You have three-tiered system: provincial, metropolitan, and palace. It was held every 3 years, and candidates prepared through the pre-CSE preparatory schools. And the fourth aspect is very important. They have this anonymization protocol. So the provincial and metropolitan exams were anonymized, meaning that the candidates didn't know who the examiners were, and the examiners didn't know who the candidates were. They actually were so careful that they hired scribes to copy the examination papers so that the examiners will not recognize the handwriting of the candidates, right? So it was a very, very sophisticated system in the 10th and 11th century. And this is the point, this is related to the point I was making before. The system was designed to vet both the technocratic capabilities by anonymization, right? So you don't know who the candidates are. You grade them on the basis of the merit. But there is a political vetting as well. The political vetting is at the level of the third stage, the palace exam. The palace exam is not anonymized. So I know exactly who the candidate is. I know who his father is, who's his father, his grandfather, whether or not they serve in the palace, right? So we actually use, in the paper with Claire, we use this difference to test whether or not CSE also valued the political backgrounds of the candidates. It turns out they do that at the palace level, but they don't do that at the provincial and metropolitan level. So essentially you get the best of the two worlds. You get the talented people as well as you get the political trustworthy people. So the last element is about standardization. By the end of the Song Dynasty, you have a focused curriculum, all on new Confucianism. And then you have the famous 8-legged essay format. That was all product of the Song Dynasty. Okay, so this is the timeline. So this is the transition period from the establishment in 605 to the end of the Song Dynasty, which is 1279. We're looking at the transition period. And then we're looking at the data here and compare with the data here. So that's the empirical strategy. So the question to ask is, are there any distinct patterns? Okay, I have 5 minutes left. Let me hurry. Are there distinct patterns in terms of politics, in terms of technology, before and after this transition period? So let me look at the political data first, but let me summarize in case I don't get all of them. Essentially, after the 11th century, you have this convergence toward Confucianism in a way that you didn't have that before. You had an overall reduction of political instability. You had a lower level of coup d'etat, the intra-elite conflicts. You had a longer rule by the emperors. You had a longer rule by the senior bureaucrats, right? After the 11th century. So this is about the ideological convergence. You just need to look at here. This is the percentage share of the Confucianist documents of all the official documents. In the Tang Dynasty, it was 36%. It jumped to 71% in the Song Dynasty. If you look at the ratios before, this is Han Dynasty, this is a Sui Dynasty, right? It held basically steady around 40%. right? And then it makes this huge jump in the Song Dynasty. This is the Ming Dynasty, 82%. This is the Qing Dynasty, 76%. So this kind of ideological homogeneity actually didn't begin to happen in China before the Song Dynasty. It's a post-Song Dynasty phenomenon. And the rest of the presentation is all about that. There's a big difference between before Song and after Song. Power transition, this is kind of a transition period, this period. Before you have a lot of coup d'etat, right? After that, you have a sharp fall of that. You have the ratio of coup relative to military conflicts, right? You have a lot of them before coup, right, in terms of ratios. After the Song, you have a sharp reduction. But during the Qing, you also have another rise of the ratio. Popular rebellions, you actually don't see much pattern. There's quite a bit of that during the Tang. After the Song, you still have the persistence of the popular rebellions. This is how many years the emperor served, and then we use a statistical technique to identify structural breaks in the data. So we let the algorithm to tell us where the structural break of the data happened. It turns out a lot of that happened in the 7th century. So ruler duration began to increase after the 7th century. And this is the probability of the ruler being deposed. You see before the 7th century, it was actually rising, and then there was a sharp fall. This is the minister data, how long the minister served in the positions. Again, you see, this is a little bit later. This is 11th century, roughly here. You see the break in the data. Again, the break is identified by the computer itself. We didn't impose any restrictions. This is the measure of how many ministers were executed by the emperor. So let's just look at the red bar. This is the Tang Dynasty. This is the Song Dynasty, right? So what these data show is that after the Tang Dynasty, you have social harmony, right? You have a 和谐社会 between the emperor and the senior ministers. The emperor stopped killing their senior ministers, so you have more stability after a Tang Dynasty. Let's look at quickly look at the inventions data, and let me just. I'm going to say that when you look at the graph, you're going to be disappointed because they're very simple graphs, but there's a lot of work behind the data set. There are about 11,000 entries in the data set. It took 4 years to build the data set. It took the efforts of 44 researchers. The measures are inventions per 10,000 population per dynasty year, right? And data are broken down by dynasties. Arguably, this is not the best way to break down the data, but I don't have time to go into that. I'll do that later. The Qing dynasty is dropped from my presentation today because there are some coding errors, complicated issues I don't need to go into. So let's look at what are the patterns. So these are the patterns that we see in the data. Imperial China had the highest inventions rates when the country was divided rather than united. And in fact, China had the highest invention rates measured by 10,000 population per capita, measured by per dynasty year. In fact, China had the highest rates when the country was in the middle of civil war, right? Shorter dynasties outperformed longer dynasties, but you may say that's not a apple-to-apple comparison. So let's just compare longer dynasties with longer dynasties and shorter dynasties with shorter dynasties, apple-to-apple comparisons. Earlier long dynasties like Han and Tang outperformed later long dynasties like Song, Ming, and Qing. Shorter dynasties before Northern Song outperformed shorter dynasties after Northern Song, like Southern Song and Yuan dynasty, right? So essentially what I'm trying to say here is that after the CSE was introduced, the invention rates began to decline. After the Song dynasty, 13th century, China's invention rates plummeted. So CSE was not very good to inventions. Before Song dynasty, what you see is this kind of boom and bust pattern. So it fluctuated a lot. After the Song dynasty, what you see is a secular decline of inventions, right? So these hold whether or not you use different, you can use different definitions of dynasties. Okay, so this is just a sort of broad definition of the dynasties from the spring, autumn, 700 BCE, all the way to Qing dynasty to 1911 CE, right? And you see this downward trend by this measure, inventions per 10,000 population per year. And this is a more refined definition of the dynasties. The Han dynasty is divided into Western Han and Eastern Han. So because historians believe that some of these long dynasties can be really classified into two dynasties. Song dynasty is divided into Northern dynasty and Southern dynasty. What you notice is that these shorter dynasties are the ones, the more divided dynasties are the more competitive dynasties in terms of inventions. And this is showing that inventions rate collapsed after the Southern Song dynasty, which is here, right? What you see before the Southern Song dynasty is that there is the pattern of up and down, up and down, up and down. After that, basically a declining dynasty is followed by a more declining dynasty, except for the Yuan, right? This is a Yuan dynasty. What also shows is that after the Southern Song dynasty, invention rates are below all the rates before the Song dynasty, invention rates of the Song dynasty, right? So essentially the highest rate, the Yuan dynasty, matched the lowest rates before the Southern Song dynasty. So essentially the highest invention rate after the Southern Song dynasty are equivalent to the lowest rates before the Northern Song dynasty, including the Northern Song itself. Okay, you know, one may say that maybe it's the population density that is driving the findings, because Ming dynasty, Song dynasty, Ming dynasty, actually Ming dynasty and Qing dynasty are very big, so there are more populations, and Song dynasty has more information. I don't have time to show this, but let me just say that it's not supported by the data. In fact, Song dynasty, Ming dynasty, and Qing dynasty have highest population densities. Right? So it's not driven by the fact that these dynasties have low population density, and therefore they have low inventions rate. Let me show this. Let me skip some of this. But what this basically shows is that it's a very interesting pattern, which is that as Chinese inventions began to decline, the Chinese economic development began to pick up. So this is a very interesting phenomenon, and this is from Ian Moore's book. He's looking at the energy consumption data. So, so this is the 7th century. Beginning in 7th century, the East economic development began to overtake the West. But that's precisely when the Chinese technology began to decline relative to the West. So this is what I call lonely idea of a technology. And this is a book about Russian technology. The argument of the book is that Russians invented a lot of technologies, but the technologies didn't produce any economic benefits. So one argument here is that Chinese produced a lot of technologies in the ancient times, but those technologies didn't really matter for economic growth. The reverse of that argument is also true. Chinese began to grow its economy after the Song dynasty, or after the Tang dynasty, but that was not really because of because of technology. It was really because of something else. So there's no relationship between technology and economic development, historically speaking. So let me conclude by drawing the implications for today. So one idea, and it's probably a controversial idea, is, are we seeing this lonely idea phenomenon again in China today, right? In the recent years, China has made a lot of progress in technology. But if you look at the total factor productivity contributions to GDP, it's actually getting lower and lower. So the contributions are becoming smaller and smaller as China has become more inventive. And there are some case examples of that. If you look at the AI applications, China is very advanced in facial recognition. We have done some work on Chinese manufacturing. Actually, Chinese manufacturing is not terribly advanced in terms of artificial intelligence. The small and medium enterprises are not affected by big data, by AI at all. And majority of the revenues of the facial recognition companies are actually government contracts rather than commercial applications, right? And the other implication is that the line between stability and stagnation is actually very thin, right? So as China got very stable politically after the Song dynasty, it became less inventive. Technologically speaking, it became more stagnant rather than more inventive. And government scaling is both an advantage and a curse, right? I already mentioned Zheng He's 7 voyages. And I think AI is another example. I'll be happy to go into that if there's interest. And the huge debate today about Gaokao, right? The higher education examination system, whether or not that's good for creativity, whether or not that is good for science and technology in China. And the importance of science in history, right? So I think one standard explanation for why China didn't develop into a technological power is because China didn't develop science. And Confucianist mindset is antithetical to scientific thinking. So, maybe this has current policy implications, right? Because the Chinese educational system today, even today, is not very good at analytical thinking. It has to rely on foreign education to develop analytical thinking, right? So there may be foreign policy implications for this. And Barry and Susan and I work on the task force study. We advocated open policy toward Chinese students and Chinese scholars. But you can make an argument, right? You can make an argument that the Chinese system itself in China is not very good at developing analytical thinking. Therefore, China relies much more on foreign educational institutions to develop that thinking. If you think China is a rival, maybe you should restrict access of Chinese scholars and Chinese students to foreign educational institutions. Okay, let me end there. Thank you very much.
Yasheng, as expected, that was fantastic, stimulating, really creative take. Let me first say, we have some great people in the audience. We've got 5 comments in the Q&A box. Please continue, feel free to ask questions, put them in the Q&A box. I will try to act as moderator and pass on as many of these as I can. We don't have much time. I'm not going to take much time, but let me start out by saying, Yasheng, what if we say that part of what you're arguing is really kind of a resurrection of a really traditional view of China. Some people call it the Naito hypothesis, right? That China sort of stagnated beginning with the Ming. And then sometimes that's being been denounced as a kind of Orientalism, or oversimplification. So on one hand, you sort of say, no, that's really right, that's true, but you are arguing more strongly that that you can identify the causal mechanism which drives this, the way that the exam system is implicated in changes of thought and all kinds of things. So do you believe that it's really the case that the perfection of the exam system is driving these big society-wide changes, or is the exam system part of some other set of changes that are occurring?
Yeah. So Barry, you are absolutely right about Naito hypothesis, right? So the great Tang-Song transition, and my argument echoes that argument, and to that extent, probably is not. I'm not saying things that are dramatically new, but just a few things. One is that he lumped Tang and Song together. I actually think we can be more precise than that. I actually don't think Tang belongs there. I focus on Song. So just as a historical matter, I think, if I can say, if there's any contribution, maybe it's a more precise formulation of his hypothesis. And the other is that he said that after the Tang-Song transition, China began to enter into this era of modernity. So he's right, because when you have an impersonal bureaucracy, that's a definition of modernity, right? So this is kind of a Max Weber view of bureaucracy. But I'm not sure that he goes as far as I do, which is that the political modernity is actually very bad for economics. It's very bad for technology. So he may have said that, but at least the things I have read, he hasn't made that point explicitly. So hopefully, there's still contributions. If he has said all of that, then I basically provide support for his idea, and I think so in the Orientalism, and I think we don't have to go there, because the China before Song Dynasty was also China, right? So we don't. I think one of the things that one of the easier things for me to do, as compared with Naito and Joseph Needham, is I don't have to compare China with the West. I just compare China against itself, right? And I don't even have to know anything about UK and Germany and all that. I just compare post-Song China with pre-Song China. And in terms of the mechanisms, I think you probably overstated what I have done. I don't think I can. I don't think I can say that I have identified a causal mechanism. Uh, but I think if you read sort of Naito and others about that period, they single out the the civil service exam system as one of the fundamental changes in that period. There could be other things going on as well, but most people singled out that as the most, if one of the most, but if not the most. So even though I don't think I have, figured out a causal mechanism, if we go by the historian's judgment of that period, then I can say, because the changes are so dramatic, so you kind of have to have a causal mechanism that is also dramatic, and the CSE seems to be that.
Great. Let me do my best to translate some of the really interesting questions in the Q&A box. Pierre Schwab has two very interesting questions. Essentially, first of all, he refers to Confucian dogmatism, which I think is a great term to put in this. But he says the shift didn't happen in a vacuum. There must have been an overlying cause for these effects to occur over this long period. And then a follow-up question also from him is, and if we think of sort of dogmatism as being the driver, how does China today pivot away from renewed appearances of dogmatism, a kind of neo-Confucian dogmatism under Xi Jinping?
Well, I mean, to be honest about China today, I'm not very optimistic, right? So he's going back to dogmatism, and I don't think that's good for economics. I don't think that's good for technology, and so I mean, there's obviously a debate about where Chinese science and technology are today. I actually think that we have a emerging living test of that hypothesis, which is the development of vaccination for COVID-19, right? China is developing that. US has developed Moderna, Pfizer, and UK has developed AstraZeneca. The Chinese vaccines, they're developing Chinese vaccines. There's no disclosure about the effectiveness. And the bit that I have read is that the best results they get is about 50% effective, right? So I'm not sure that's a fair test, but I think we do need to be realistic about, the power of Chinese scientific establishment and all of that. I think in the case of vaccine, we may know within this year, exactly how effective the Chinese vaccines are. And my prediction is that they're going to fall short from what I have read. So I don't have any. And I think that the system, the design of the system, and the fact that the system has even gone back even more toward this dogmatic direction, that's not good for science. That's not good for technology. So if and the other question about the underlying forces, yes, I fully agree with that. I don't think I understand what are the fundamental forces pushing China toward this Confucian dogmatism during that period of time. I have a technical kind of explanation, which is this, I call it operating system, right? So you have this machinery, but how exactly the machinery arose, I don't really know. Yeah.
Another question that I think comes in right at this point is, what's your sort of intellectual dialogue with Mark Elvin's high-level equilibrium trap, and also with Pierre Bourdieu's cultural capital, the field of power? How do you see yourself fitting with these scholars?
Well, so the high level, so I think the I agree with the equilibrium part, but the high level part is, I mean, China fell pretty badly, right? So it 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 was able to achieve certain high level. Song Dynasty was probably the peak of Chinese economic development and technological development, and then it rapidly degenerated. So I know that there's a California school that argues that by even by as late as the mid 19th century, the Yangtze region was about the same in terms of per capita GDP to UK. I think more recent research, more sort of based on more detailed data, casts a lot of doubt on that. And Chinese per capita economic output was much below that of Britain and Holland long before mid 19th century. Maybe Yuan, maybe soon. So this is more recent research by a number of economists. So I think the stagnation, the decline, but the stagnation and decline happened in a very stable manner, right? So politically, it was extremely stable, and so that's the interesting hook of my book. How you manage this slide with stability, and that shows. So I may sound very negative on the civil service examinations. I actually have huge amount of respect for it. You know, for any system that could help the political stability for some 700 years, you got to have some respect for that. Even though it was not very good for technology and economics, it at least held up the country together. Also, that's another thing. It holds up the country together, right? So for such a large, complex country, it's able to hold up the country together. That's, depending on your political point of view, that can be achievement, that can be something bad. But that we got to acknowledge that.
Yeah, we're almost out of time, but let me ask you one super quick technical question from Gonglei. He says, you scale these technology results to population, but since the Qing population was so much bigger than earlier population, don't you think you should also show just the total amount of technological capital that's created as well? Maybe as a backup, not that it's better. But.
Yeah, so we're going to do that. By the way, that's a very good question. To do that, what is important is you got to have more refined data on the timing of the inventions, because the dynasties vary in length, right? So some can be 400 years, some can be 100 years, and our current classification is very crude. So we are now trying to classify these by maybe a 50-year window, maybe 100-year window. There's no way to do this on an annual basis. But the problem is that you run into immediate problem of a lot of missing data, because many of these inventions, we can say, oh, it happened in the Han Dynasty, maybe in the early Han Dynasty, maybe in late Han Dynasty, but you can't really attach a year to it, right? So we're working on that. So, but that's the first thing. Then you can look at sort of the annual, but implicitly it is still scaled by something. It's scaled by year, right? But at least you have a uniform unit of time. Now we don't even have that. So once we have that, we're going to do that. But the other thing is that uh, what matters, you can say, yes, Qing dynasty has big population, but there should be more inventors too, right? So it's if you believe that inventors are some fixed proportion to the population, so just automatically it shouldn't reduce the inventions rate, right? So it can hold steady, it can decrease a little bit, but what we see is a sharp decline of the inventions rate. The third thing I want to say is that the population, it's not so much the size of the population that matters, is the density, right? So the urban density, that's why, Silicon Valley, Boston, New York, these are the most inventive places because they have high population density. Qing has one of the highest population densities. Song has the highest. Song has the highest. Qing, even though it has big territory, but as he pointed out, it also has big population. So population density is actually, it has higher population densities as compared with those dynasties that have a higher inventions rate. So automatically, I don't think it's a problem, but I acknowledge the potential issues there. Yeah.
Well, I am very sad to report that we really have to wrap up. We face this hard deadline after an hour. I also need to make a quick announcement. Join us for our next webinar, January 25th. Marika Olberg of the German Marshall Fund and Jessica Batke of China File have analyzed government records on surveillance technology. So I have to put that plug in for the next event, but much more important. Yasheng, thank you so much. You did not disappoint one iota when it came to presenting some really fascinating, really new ideas that give us an opportunity to look at familiar historical material in ways that are really fresh and new. So thank you very much. We're very grateful for your presentation.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you. I really enjoyed the interactions. Thank you.
Thank you. So long, everybody. See you next time.